viewers, welcome to the 60th and last lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. We will conclude our course and the discussion of 20th century poetry with a few comments on the life and work of Arun Kolatkar. In a way, it is fitting that we do this because Kolatkar, in his life and work, ties together many of the disparate threads that shape 20th century poetry. This statement will make sense when I talk about how Kolatkar inherits and synthesizes many strands of intellectual and creative expression that were active in the 20th century in his work. They will culminate in his first volume, which won the Commonwealth Prize in the year 1976, that is Jejuri. Before that, we will wrap up a discussion of the turnaround, which I've read out in the last lecture, and which was a very important formative experience as well as expression for Kolatkar. Through conversations with Kolatkar, Mehrotra identifies the biographical context and tells us that the poem is based on a walking trip inspired by and about a walking trip taken through Western Maharashtra. The contexts of that trip emerge from events that the poet describes. The poet says that at Rotegaon he went on trial, that a dog died in the temple where he was trying to get some sleep. The context for this is that there was a mistake in the town where the poet Kolatkar and his friend were mistakenly assumed to be doing some crimes, and they were scared by that. So they did some work in the temple. They moved a carcass and they did some social work, which convinced the local people that they were okay. And once they did that, they were allowed to go free. By the time Kolatkar reached Kopargaon, it had become physically unendurable for him to continue walking. Mehrotra also explains what this phrase Tinshaw Hijira means. Kolatkar gives all the facts about the trip, including the year. Right? The dramatic opening lines, "Bombay made me a beggar," leaves several questions open. It suggests that despite the education, the cosmopolitanism, the range of inspirations available to poets, this poet appeared to be quite dissatisfied. And he gives the impression that something had made him want to leave the city and seek the open road. It's not clear, though, if he had a destination in mind or even an itinerary. It's also very difficult to say, as his route suggests, was headed to the pilgrimage town of Shirdi, which is only 14 kilometers from Kopargaon. The poet mentions that he reached Kopargaon the year Stalin died, and that year matches with what the biography says. That is, Stalin died in the year 1953, and that is the year in which Kolatkar composed this poem, or at least began writing the poem. Or at least this was the year in which the walking trip was undertaken, even though the poem about the trip was written a few years later. Kolatkar reveals in conversation that that the friend who accompanied him on this walking trip was Bandhu Vez, and there is a reference to Vez in the poem, The Renunciation of the Dog. I'll read that poem briefly. The Renunciation of the Dog. Tell me why, the night before we started, dogs were vainly barking at the waves. And tell me why, in an unknown temple, days and waves away, a black dog dumbly, from out of nowhere of ourselves, yawned and leapt, and leaving us naked and shamefaced. Tell me why the black dog died intriguingly between God and our heads. Now this poem, The Renunciation of the Dog, was first published in the magazine Quest, whose editor, Nissim Ezekiel, happened to be a fellow Bombayite and also a fellow advertising professional who met Kolatkar and took a great interest in the poem. Kolatkar, now returning to the context of the walking trip, Kolatkar tells to Mehrotra that they spent the night before they started the walking trip at the gateway of India, which is where he heard the dogs vainly barking at the waves. And they had most likely slept rough on the footpath. For the poet Kolatkar and his friend, this would be the first of many such nights of rough sleeping. Who was Bandhu Vaiz? Again, biographical details are offered by Mehrotra. The two, that is Vaiz and Kolatkar, met in 52 when Kolatkar was a student at the JJ School of Art. Dilip Chitre, the poet, the artist, who's written a lot about Kolatkar and their circle, describes Vaiz as a maverick, a self-taught artist with immense energy and conviction that many of his academically cultivated colleagues lacked. So this was common to both of these individuals, the poet and the painter, with a great deal of original creative energy, which meant that they felt alienated from the group, from the larger group of academically cultivated colleagues. Now, to establish further context, Mehrotra talks to other friends and colleagues of Kolatkar, one of whom remembers Kolatkar and Vaiz arriving at their father's house in Pune, unshaved and tired, looking like two sadhus. When they sat down to a meal, he said, it was as though they had not eaten in days. Indeed, accounts of eating, or more often not eating, recur throughout this poem, such as this phrase, I arrived in Nasik with people leaves between my teeth. The trial, which is mentioned in the turnaround, refers to an incident that happened in the year that the renunciation of the dog was composed. Both poems refer to an incident at the temple. What is this incident? The incident itself is not described, but in conversation, in biographical writing, Mehrotra describes what this incident was. In Kolatkar's narration, there had been a series of petty thefts in Rotegaon, and the suspicion of the townsfolk fell on the two tramps, that is, these two travelers, these two walkers. They were hauled up before a group of elders. This is the trial that's referred to in the turnaround. They had a hard time proving their innocence. When they were finally allowed to leave, it was on the condition that they first clean up the temple, drag the carcass away, where on the one night they had spent in it, a black dog had died intriguingly between God and our heads. So a dog had passed away in a temple, and the social work which Kolatkar and his friend Vaiz did in order to earn the goodwill of the villagers and to let themselves be allowed to pass through without being tried for the crime of petty theft, was to move the carcass of this dog that had passed away in a temple. Quite a grim story, but the details, the unspeakable, the unforgettable details are etched very finely in the words of the poem. Kolatkar said the dog had died at the midpoint between where they had lain down to sleep, that is our heads, and the temple idol, that is God. Kolatkar also had a very unique gloss for the phrase Tinshaw Hijira. Tinshaw referred to Nana Patil's Patri Sarkar, or horseshoe government. Patil was a well-known revolutionary leader during colonial times and ran a parallel government in the villages around Satara in the 1940s. Those found defying its orders and collaborating with the British had, in a very violent act, like a horseshoe, a tin nailed to the soles of their feet. Kolatkar in this poem is comparing his suffering after his Hijira or flight from Bombay. It was walk, walk, walk and walk all the way. That's the sentence. With the suffering of those punished by Patil's Patri Sarkar. So Kolatkar is saying that he had walked so much that he felt as if his feet had become tin-shod, as if someone had nailed tin to his feet. And again, the description of the sun, which shining like a hammer on his head, also accentuates and amplifies this image of being so tired that natural things feel like the violence of a hammer hitting Kolatkar's body. The poem ends on a note that, in more sense than one, is visionary. And we are told how lying prostrate before this old man was a cut up can of kerosene. This detail, the can of kerosene which was cut in half, is something that Kolatkar remembers with great vividness. It was cut in half, Kolatkar remembers, and looked as though the old man had beaten the life out of it. As he spoke, he seemed to be reliving the satiric experience of 50 years ago. I thought about it for a mile or two, but I knew already that it was time to turn around. About the personal crisis, though, which had led him to renounce the city he was returning to, he did not say anything. That is, Kolatkar only hints that there was a personal crisis which had inspired the walk and which is now abandoned, not because, or not obviously or evidently because the crisis which inspired the walk is resolved. We don't know that, but maybe simply because the poet has been exhausted by the physical toll that this walking has taken on his body. During this early phase, Kolatkar also wrote a poem which was among his early English poems, and which was published, as I mentioned earlier, in The Boat Ride and Other Poems from 2008. This other iconic poem is titled Irani Restaurant, Bombay. And this is how the first three stanzas go. The cock-eyed Shah of Iran watches the cake decompose carefully in a cracked showcase, distracted only by a fly on the make as it finds in a loafer's wrist an operational base. So the scene that these lines create is almost like a painting, almost like a still life painting of the inside of a restaurant. On the wall or somewhere is a photo of the Shah of Iran, because obviously it is run by people who have some family or native connections to Iran. There's a picture of the Shah of Iran, and the picture suggests, in the poet's imagination, it appears as if the Shah of Iran is looking with a very particular kind of attitude, which the poet describes with the word cock-eyed. The poet imagines a kind of suspicion, some kind of unhappiness, some kind of negativity, but also a negativity that borders on indifference in this portrait of the Shah of Iran, which is placed somewhere in the restaurant. And the poet imagines that the Shah of Iran's gaze is directed at something else in the restaurant. So the disapproval of the Shah of Iran is probably coming from the fact that he can see the cake that is cooked in the restaurant and baked in the restaurant, and waiting for someone to purchase it, decomposing slowly in a cracked showcase, right? And like in most sweet shops, there are flies that try to attack or sit on the sweetmeats that are kept, and they're often obstructed by a glass barrier. There are glass barriers which hold the sweets, and the flies try to attack the food, but without knowing that there is a barrier of glass that separates them from the food. So the flies keep butting themselves onto the glass case. And this is the scene that the Shah of Iran is watching. And the poet is describing it, trying to imagine a narrative in these details. And the fly, unable to penetrate the glass, instead settles down on a loafer's wrist. So this is the poet and the painter creating a visual painting by looking at the scene inside a restaurant in Bombay. The next stanza goes thus. Dogmatically green and elaborate trees defeat breeze. The crooked swan begs pardon if it disturb the pond. The road, neat as a needle, points at a lovely cottage with a garden. The thirsty loafer sees the stylized perfection of the landscape in a glass of water wobble. A sticky tea print for his scholarly attention singles out a verse from the blank testament of the table. So, a very elaborate and complicated image, and let me briefly unpack that. The trees are thick enough that they can block the wind. So, it just means that it is very hot and humid in Bombay. The crooked swan begs pardon if it disturb the pond. The road, neat as a needle, points at a lovely cottage with a garden. The thirsty loafer sees the stylized perfection of the landscape in a glass of water wobble. So this landscape, it is from a painting probably that's hung on the wall inside this restaurant. It's reflected in a glass of water, and it wobbles. The detail with which the poet is looking at this glass of water, the observation of the wobble in the layer of water in the glass, all of this goes to suggest that the poet is paying very, very close attention to what is happening inside the restaurant. And instead, the poet projects this act of paying attention onto the person inside the restaurant. The poet writes, a sticky tea print for his scholarly attention singles out a verse from the blank testament of the table. So, a very elaborate but a simple image. A simple image described in an elaborate metaphor by combining multiple images. So, what is happening? A loafer is sitting on the restaurant. He has kept his hand on the table. He is drinking tea, right? The cup of tea, because of the little tea that rolls down the edge and leaves a mark, the shape of the cup on the table, right? That is called a tea print. The mark that the cup of tea leaves on the table is described as a verse, right? So the image of the restaurant is blank. The table is a verse in that blank canvas, and when the loafer places the cup of tea on the table and lifts it again, it leaves a mark. That mark gives the image that the poet is describing a musical quality. So ultimately, what the poet has achieved in these three stanzas is that the poet has described a scene inside a restaurant, and through his sensitive, empathetic act of observing, by paying very sincere and close attention to the details of this restaurant, the poet has created a music and has invited us to imagine and to listen to the musicality and the picturesque quality of the scene inside this restaurant. The scholar Letita Zacchini notes that Kolatkar is like Constantine Guy, the painter of modern life, sitting in the window of a coffee house. She calls his outlook vernacular cosmopolitanism, deeply local yet tuned to global artistic currents. Now, this poem was written in the year 1962, and in this poem, Kolatkar anticipates Walter Benjamin's essays on the arcade-haunting Parisian flaneur. In all likelihood, Kolatkar had not heard of Walter Benjamin, but as a Bombay loafer himself, someone who daily trudged the city's footpaths, particularly the area of Kala Ghoda, he would have recognized the figure. Over the centuries, loafer has almost become an Indian word of abuse, suggesting a good-for-nothing who drifts through the city in self-absorbed fashion when, in fact, he is streetwise and his keen eye doesn't miss a thing. Kolatkar himself seldom walked past a pavement bookstall without picking up a treasure. This is true of the loafer even when he appears most relaxed, having tea, say, in an Irani restaurant, a portrait of the cockeyed Shah of Iran displayed above the till, and the whole place buzzing with flies. Now, another series of poems also concerns the location of this restaurant, but the perspective is shifted. In the series of poems called the Kala Ghoda poems, Kolatkar changes his perspective. While in Irani restaurant Bombay, Kolatkar describes the inside of a restaurant. In the Kala Ghoda poems, Kolatkar sits inside a restaurant and describes the view outside the restaurant. That is the subject of the Kala Ghoda poems. Now, this also has a very, very real biographical context. On most days, around breakfast time and again in the late afternoon, after the lunch crowd had left, Kolatkar could be found at Wayside Inn in Rampart Row. He would usually be alone except on Thursday afternoons, when all those who wished to see him joined his table, and there could be as many as 15 people around it. In the early 1980s, Kolatkar got the idea of writing a series of poems dedicated to a very particular set of people, places, sights, and sounds. The objects of Kolatkar's attention were the varied population, that is, the lavatory attendant, the municipal sweeper, the kerosene vendor, the beggar cum tambourine player, the drug pusher, the shoe shine, the ogress who bathes her baby boy, the idli lady, the rat poison man, the cellist, the lawyer. So the first and the most important object of Kolatkar's attention in these poems were the people around that location. Second, Kolatkar also paid a very sincere degree of attention to animals. There were dogs, crows around that restaurant, around that location, Kala Ghoda, which is an artistic establishment in Bombay. There was an arts festival named as the Kala Ghoda Festival, which is an annual celebration and exhibition of art. Kolatkar also paid very close attention to the statues, that is David Sassoon's statue on Kala Ghoda Street. Kolatkar also described the commercial establishments and its public buildings. The important commercial establishment was the London Blockley office, and the important public buildings nearby were St. Andrew's Church, Max Muller Bhavan, Prince of Wales Museum, and Jahangir Art Gallery. Now, in addition to being inspired by these locations, restaurants, coffee shops in Bombay, Kolatkar was also very powerfully influenced by popular American culture, especially African American vernacular and blues music. Kolatkar liked blues music because he considered it to be improvised, less formal, and more spontaneous than other kinds of poetry and music. He also found very interesting the social history of blues music, particularly its connection to criminal, sublegal, and gang-related elements. The social history of Western music, especially blues, also inspired Kolatkar. During the Depression, blues performers moved from place to place, playing in honky-tonks, sometimes under the protection of mobsters. He remembered the Elton John song, "Don't Shoot Me, I'm Only the Piano Player." Blues, though it can have a spiritual side, and Bhakti poetry are in intent markedly different from each other. One belongs to the secular world, the other addresses itself to God. Despite these very obvious differences, however, there are some very deep parallels in the poetic styles of these two genres. Each draws its images from a common pool, each limits itself to a small number of themes that it keeps returning to, and each speaks in the idiom of the street. They can, if listened to with an appropriately sensitive and keen ear, which Kolatkar had, they can sound remarkably alike. Some examples that Mehrotra provides help make the point. From the blues singer Bessie Smith, these are the lines. It's a long old road, but I'm going to find the end. It's a long old road, but I'm going to find the end. And when I get there, I'm going to shake hands with a friend. These lines may very well be mistaken for something from the Marathi Bhakti poet, the saint Tukaram. In Tukaram, we find lines that in turn sound a lot like blues music, albeit in an English translation by Kolatkar himself. So Kolatkar translated lines from the poet Tukaram and did it so that it read and sounded like lines from blues music. And one example that Mehrotra quotes goes thus: "Get lost, brother, if you don't fancy our kind of living." There are more parallels between blues music and Bhakti poetry in Marathi, especially Bhakti poetry in Marathi translated into English by Kolatkar. One example is that of Tommy McLennan writing about waiting for a bus. Here is Tommy McLennan. Here comes that greyhound with his tongue hanging out the side. Here comes that greyhound with his tongue hanging out on the side. You have to buy a ticket if you want to ride. And here is Kolatkar in Jejuri, a poem that we will read shortly. The bus goes around in a circle, stops inside the bus station, and stands purring softly in front of the priest, a cat grin on his face and a live, ready-to-eat pilgrim held between its teeth. So what Kolatkar has done is that he has personified the bus into a cat, and the pilgrims that are being carried in the bus are described as little worms or little rats that the cat has grabbed and is about to eat them. This image makes sense seen in the context of the original poem, which is titled The Priest. The priest is waiting in front of the temple, waiting for the bus, which is like a cat, to bring some prey, some rats caught in its teeth, so that the priest can get some money out of them. These pilgrims who've come from cities to this temple town of Jejuri often donate alms, give alms, either food or money to the priest. So that explains to us that Kolatkar was deeply influenced by popular American and African American culture, especially blues music. Kolatkar was known for having an extremely eclectic range of literary influences. In an interview with Eunice de Souza, when he was asked about the writers he liked and was inspired by, Kolatkar named 80 writers, an astoundingly eclectic list of writers covering an almost unimaginable breadth geographically, historically, and culturally. Writers that Kolatkar named as those who inspired him came from 19th century America and England, that is, Gerard Manley Hopkins and Walt Whitman. They came from ancient China, they came from ancient Rome, they came from the Marathi Bhakti tradition. Some of them were modernist American and contemporary British poets. Some were popular musicians, such as Woody Guthrie. Other influences, writers that Kolatkar counted among his influences were directors, auteurs and artists and filmmakers such as Akira Kurosawa, Sergei Eisenstein, Andrzej Wajda, and Francois Truffaut. The reason for such an eclectic range of influences, one reason for it in any case, is offered by Dilip Chitre, who says that there had been a paperback revolution, which meant that such a wide range of inspiration could have reached Arun Kolatkar, the advertising professional, who managed to turn these wide-ranging influences into poems. And the phrase that Dilip Chitre uses is that this paperback revolution created an intellectual proletariat that was the product of the rise in literacy and was exposed to these diverse influences. Now, we'll briefly wrap up this discussion with with a short discussion on Jejuri. Jejuri is a sequence of 31 poems based on a visit to a temple town of the same name. The main attraction of Jejuri is the Khandoba temple, a folk god popular with the nomadic and pastoral communities of Maharashtra and northern Karnataka. Only incidentally, though, is Jejuri about a temple town or matters of faith. In Mehrotra's words, at its heart and at the heart of all Kolatkar's work lies a moral vision, whose basis is the things of this world, precisely, rapturously observed. So for Mehrotra, Jejuri both is and isn't about religion. It is religion only in the intellectual and artistic sense that paying close attention to the things around us is a sort of enchantment, is a sort of rapture. If that is so, then all poets and all good poets are religious, because just as religion produces an enchantment in which simply the sight of ordinary things produces a rapture, similarly, in a poet's vision, describing and observing reality, one becomes religious. And there is a 19th century precursor to this sort of a religiosity, to the kind of religiosity that can be found in the way a poet observes reality. The poet from the Victorian tradition, Christina Rossetti, most powerfully embodies this kind of an intellectual impulse. In the poems of Christina Rossetti, the natural world is observed with a great deal of enchantment and joy. Simply observing the natural world as a creation of God gives the poet the particular kind of vibrancy and life that emerges from her descriptions of nature. For Mehrotra, similarly, we can find a similar rapture in Kolatkar's work, even though Kolatkar is much more secular and much more irreverent than any Victorian poet could be. For Mehrotra, Jejuri stages a relationship between two things. On one hand, clear, sharp observations, and on the other, an abundant sympathy. The causal link went both ways. Sympathy means that the poem becomes acts of attention. And it was because the poet is able to pay attention, because the poet is able to embody and inhabit a place of sympathetic observation, that the poems themselves are so clear and so sharp. I'll read one poem briefly and wrap up our discussion. The first poem of Jejuri is titled The Bus. The tarpaulin flaps are buttoned down on the windows of the state transport bus, all the way up to Jejuri. A cold wind keeps whipping and slapping a corner of tarpaulin at your elbow. You look down to the roaring road. You search for the signs of daybreak in what little light spills out of bus. Your own divided face in the pair of glasses on an old man's nose is all the countryside you get to see. You seem to move continually forward toward a destination just beyond the caste mark beyond his eyebrows. Outside, the sun has risen quietly. It aims through an eyelet in the tarpaulin and shoots at the old man's glasses. A sawed-off sunbeam comes to rest gently against the driver's right temple. The bus seems to change direction. At the end of the bumpy ride, with your own face on either side when you get off the bus, you don't step inside the old man's head. This poem tells us exactly why Arun Kolatkar's work is so compelling, how it is inspired by the imagism, the sharpness of modernist poetry, and how Kolatkar inhabits a very, very unique place in poetic descriptions of religious pilgrimages and religious experiences. In doing so, Kolatkar connects his writing, connects Indian writing in English to a very powerful tradition in 20th century poetry, that is, writing about religious experiences, not as religion, not to support institutional religion, but to explore a spiritual experience that is common to all human beings. Important 20th century precursors of this kind of poetry were T.S. Eliot and Philip Larkin. T.S. Eliot's poems, culminating in 4 quartets, do precisely that. They explore in powerful, simple, accessible, poetic language the power of spiritual exploration. Similarly, Philip Larkin, in his poem Church Going, expresses and reaches a kind of humanity, a kind of sadness, a kind of universal sadness, despite not having an iota of sympathy for the institutionalized religion. The church is not simply religion, rather it is an expression of a human struggle to maintain a connection to something spiritual in an extremely materialist and impatient world. Kolatkar's poems in Jejuri take us to that deeply spiritual and human place. And the journey to that spiritual place begins, like Kolatkar's own journey, by bus. And in poems, the journey to that spiritual location begins with a material description in very short, simple sentences of the quality of the journey, the sights and sounds that Kolatkar experiences as he sits on that bus. With this, we have reached the end of our discussion of 20th century poetry. It has been an incredibly rich, enriching, varied journey for me. I have learned a lot while discussing this subject with you. I believe there's a lot more to be said still, but for the purposes of this course, I will stop here. And I hope that we can continue this journey in a different course, in a different context in the future. Thank you.